Jeff Chandler, finally. For decades, Dr. Phil McGraw stood in American living rooms as the man who fixed broken marriages. He told couples when to stay, when to leave, and how to tell the difference. But behind that certainty was a private life that grew quieter, lonelier, and far more complicated than anyone imagined. At 74, Dr. Phil is no longer speaking as an expert looking in from the outside. He is speaking as the man who finally had to face the one truth he avoided the longest: the marriage everyone believed in. For nearly half a century, Dr. Phil and Robin McGraw represented stability in a world where celebrity marriages rarely survived the spotlight. They met in the aftermath of his failed first marriage, married young, and built a life that appeared unshakable. 2 sons, Jay and Jordan, 4 grandchildren, a home life repeatedly described as calm, supportive, and drama-free. To the public, their relationship looked less like a marriage under pressure and more like a blueprint for success. When Dr. Phil's television career took off, Robin was not hidden in the background. She became part of the narrative. She appeared on the show. She co-authored books. She spoke openly about communication, honesty, and a household where voices were never raised. At one point, Robin even said she and Phil simply did not fight, not because they avoided conflict, but because they made a decision early on that screaming and hostility would never exist in their home. That statement became legendary, repeated in interviews, quoted by fans, and used as proof that long-term love could be peaceful. Dr. Phil reinforced that image at every opportunity. In interviews, he credited Robin as the stabilizing force in his life. He described her as the reason his advice worked, because he lived it himself. Viewers were encouraged to trust him not just because of his credentials, but because his own marriage seemed to embody everything he taught on screen. Even as rumors surfaced over the years, the McGraws publicly dismissed them. Divorce speculation came and went, often fueled by tabloids, but never confirmed. In a widely circulated interview later in life, Dr. Phil insisted that the word divorce had never been spoken in their home and that they had never separated. To many fans, that was enough. The marriage endured. The image held. But longevity does not always mean closeness, and perfection, when maintained too carefully for too long, can quietly turn into pressure. What the audience saw was consistency. What they did not see was how much effort it took to keep that version of the marriage alive, and what slowly disappeared in the process. Reeks. Silence on Jane Russell. The first marriage. He never talked about. Long before Dr. Phil became a trusted voice on relationships, he was a 20-year-old college student who believed marriage was simply the next step in life. In 1970, he married Debbie Higgins McCall, his high school sweetheart. At the time, the pairing looked perfect on the surface. He was the star football player. She was the cheerleader. From the outside, it felt inevitable. Years later, Dr. Phil would describe that decision with striking bluntness. He admitted that there was no deep reflection, no careful evaluation of compatibility. It was momentum, not intention. In his own words, it was a marriage that happened because it felt like what young people were supposed to do next. According to him, the relationship ended quietly. No shouting, no dramatic blow-ups. Just a conversation where both asked themselves why they had gotten married at all. But Debbie Higgins McCall told a different story, one that Dr. Phil rarely acknowledged publicly. According to Debbie, the marriage did not end because it simply ran out of meaning. She said it ended because of infidelity. She claimed she confronted Phil about multiple affairs and that he did not deny them. Instead, she recalled being told to grow up and accept that this was how the world worked. Debbie later explained that she chose to stay silent when Phil rose to fame, believing there was nothing good to come from speaking out. Only after he publicly acknowledged having been divorced did she share her perspective, carefully stating that every relationship has 2 sides. The marriage was annulled in 1973, just 3 years after it began. It disappeared quickly, quietly, and almost completely from Dr. Phil's public story. For decades, it was treated as a footnote, something too old, too brief, or too inconvenient to matter. But that first marriage left behind more than paperwork. It introduced themes that would return later in subtle ways: emotional distance, power imbalance, competing narratives, and a sharp divide between how relationships appeared publicly and how they were experienced privately. It also set a precedent for something else: silence. Dr. Phil moved forward without fully addressing the past, and the world followed his lead. Just 3 years after that annulment, he married Robin. To most people, it looked like a clean reset, a better match, a stronger foundation, a happier ending. But when you look closely, it also raises a difficult question. Did Dr. Phil change, or did he simply become better at controlling the story? When marriage became part of the brand. When Robin McGraw entered Dr. Phil's life in the mid-1970s, she represented everything his first marriage had not been. She was younger, emotionally steady, and deeply supportive. Their relationship began while Dr. Phil was still finalizing the annulment of his first marriage, and they married at the first opportunity. From the beginning, Robin became more than a spouse. She became a stabilizing force, a confidant, and eventually an extension of his professional identity. As Dr. Phil's career evolved, Robin's presence only grew stronger. She stood beside him during the creation of Courtroom Sciences, through his early appearances on television, and throughout the rise of his daytime talk show. When the program launched, Robin did not remain at home. She attended every taping. For more than 2 decades, she was physically present in the studio, watching, listening, and helping shape the tone of the show. Dr. Phil later admitted that her presence was not symbolic. It was strategic. He believed she balanced his intensity and helped connect with a predominantly female audience. Over time, their marriage stopped being private. It became instructional. Robin appeared on screen to discuss communication and emotional safety. Together, they wrote books about relationships. They spoke publicly about honesty, boundaries, and respect. The message was consistent. This marriage worked because both people worked on it constantly. Fans were not just watching a couple, they were watching a model. But maintaining that model required an unusual level of closeness. Dr. Phil and Robin rarely spent time apart. They publicly stated that they never allowed themselves to be separated for more than 2 or 3 days. Even when travel made distance unavoidable, they stayed connected through constant communication. Robin admitted she struggled to sleep when Phil was not physically present. This dynamic was presented as devotion, but it was also rigid. Space, something many healthy marriages rely on, was nearly non-existent. The line between partnership and dependence grew thinner. Robin's identity became increasingly intertwined with Dr. Phil's career, his schedule, and his public image. Her constant presence reinforced the idea that their marriage was unbreakable. But it also meant that there was little room for either of them to change without disrupting everything they had built. From the outside, the marriage looked strong. From the inside, it was becoming structured around consistency rather than connection. And the longer that structure held, the harder it became to admit that something essential was quietly slipping away. The rumors he could never fully silence. As Dr. Phil and Robin McGraw's public image grew stronger, so did the scrutiny. With every year their marriage was held up as an example, expectations rose higher, and curiosity followed. Rumors began to circulate quietly at first, then with increasing persistence. Some were easily dismissed, others refused to disappear. One of the most damaging patterns involved allegations of infidelity. Long before these rumors touched his second marriage, they were already tied to his first. Debbie Higgins McCall had publicly stated that cheating ended their relationship, and that Phil never denied it when confronted. That history mattered, even decades later, because it shaped how new rumors were received. When accusations surfaced suggesting inappropriate relationships during his professional life, they did not appear in a vacuum. Among the most troubling claims was an allegation that Dr. Phil had an affair in the late 1980s with a much younger therapy patient. The claim was never proven. Dr. Phil never publicly addressed it in detail, but the silence itself became part of the story. For a man who built his career confronting uncomfortable truths head-on, the absence of clarity stood out. Critics questioned how someone who spoke so forcefully against infidelity on television could avoid addressing allegations tied to his own past. At the same time, tension reportedly surfaced behind the scenes of his marriage. In 2009, rumors emerged that Robin McGraw was considering writing a deeply personal memoir, one that would go beyond wellness and inspiration and into the realities of her life as Dr. Phil's wife. According to unverified sources close to the couple, the idea caused significant strain. It was suggested that Dr. Phil feared such a book could expose aspects of their marriage that conflicted with his public persona. What followed was telling. The memoir was never written. No explanation was offered. No denial was issued. The story faded, but the implication lingered, that there were boundaries even Robin could not cross publicly, and truths that could not be shared without consequences. As years passed, the marriage remained intact, but increasingly sealed off. Their unity felt less like openness and more like control. Rumors were not addressed directly, they were outlasted. The strategy worked, but it came at a cost. Silence, once a protective shield, slowly became a weight. And behind that carefully maintained calm, emotional distance continued to grow. What the public saw was strength. What they did not see was how much effort it took to keep unanswered questions from tearing through the foundation. When the advice no longer worked at home. By the time Dr. Phil and Robin McGraw entered their later years together, the shape of their marriage had quietly changed. There was no single argument, no scandal that forced a reckoning. Instead, the distance arrived slowly, almost invisibly, shaped by routine, responsibility, and the weight of living inside a public role for too long. Dr. Phil's career never truly slowed down. The demands of television, constant travel, production schedules, and the pressure to remain authoritative never eased. Even as he spoke daily about emotional awareness and connection, his own life became increasingly structured around performance and control. Robin, meanwhile, began to focus more on her own interests, particularly in women's health and wellness. She supported his work, but her identity no longer revolved entirely around it. As their children grew up and left home, a central purpose that had once unified them disappeared. Parenting had provided shared focus, shared urgency, and shared meaning. Without it, the couple faced each other more directly and realized how little space remained for genuine intimacy. They were still together constantly, rarely apart physically, but emotionally, the gap widened. What made this period especially difficult was the irony. Dr. Phil had spent decades explaining how marriages fail when couples stop communicating honestly. Yet in his own relationship, honesty became complicated by reputation. Acknowledging dissatisfaction would have meant dismantling the very image that defined his career. The marriage was no longer just personal. It was symbolic. Attempts to reconnect reportedly fell short. Conversations became careful. Problems were discussed, but rarely resolved. The dynamic shifted into something quieter and more practical. Companionship replaced passion. Obligation replaced desire. To the outside world, nothing appeared wrong. Inside, both partners began to recognize a painful truth. They were living parallel lives under the same roof. For Dr. Phil, this realization cut deeply. He had always taught that love requires constant effort, but effort alone could not recreate something that had naturally faded. The marriage was not hostile. It was simply empty in the ways that mattered most. And eventually the question he had helped thousands of others answer became unavoidable in his own life. Not whether they could stay together, but whether they should. The decision that ended 47 years. The decision to end a marriage that had lasted nearly 5 decades did not come suddenly. For Dr. Phil and Robin McGraw, it was the result of years of quiet realization rather than one defining moment. There was no public confrontation, no dramatic betrayal revealed at the end. What finally pushed them forward was the shared understanding that the marriage they were protecting no longer existed in the way it once had. According to those familiar with the situation, the turning point came when both acknowledged that their relationship had shifted into something closer to coexistence than partnership. They were still respectful, still supportive, still careful with each other. But the emotional connection that once anchored everything had faded. What remained was habit, and the responsibility of maintaining an image that millions had come to believe in. Ironically, it was Dr. Phil's own philosophy that made denial impossible. For years, he had told guests that authenticity mattered more than appearances, that staying in a relationship out of fear or obligation only deepened long-term damage. Applying that same logic to his own life forced him into a painful contradiction. Continuing to present a version of his marriage that no longer reflected reality would have meant betraying the very principles he built his career on. The decision to divorce was mutual. There was no public blame, no legal spectacle, and no financial war. Despite Dr. Phil's substantial net worth, money was reportedly not the central issue. Privacy was. Both were determined to protect their children, grandchildren, and whatever remained of their personal bond. The separation was framed not as failure, but as an honest conclusion to a chapter that had run its course. In reflecting on the divorce, Dr. Phil acknowledged the irony without deflecting it. He admitted that expertise does not grant immunity, and that long-term relationships can change in ways that effort alone cannot reverse. He spoke about humility, about learning that sometimes love transforms into something quieter, something that no longer fits the shape of marriage. For the first time, Dr. Phil was no longer offering advice from a position of certainty. He was speaking as someone who had lived the outcome, and that, more than anything, marked the end of the role he had played for decades, and the beginning of a more complicated truth. Dr. Phil spent a lifetime telling others when to hold on and when to let go, until he had to answer that question himself. Do you believe ending a long marriage can be an act of honesty rather than failure? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more real stories behind public images, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay with us.